This is chapter 22, part C, with the respiratory system. This is going to be talking about both the oxygen and carbon dioxide transport in the blood as it is associated with the respiratory system. Starting first with oxygen transport, the oxygen is going to be dissolved, some of it in the plasma. Most of it will be bound to the hemoglobin. That is part of the red blood cell. Each hemoglobin molecule can transport up to 4 oxygen molecules. So when you see the term oxyhemoglobin, that just means that you do have oxygen bound to that hemoglobin. Deoxyhemoglobin means that the hemoglobin has now released that oxygen and it is not bound. So when we talk about loading or unloading of oxygen, what we're simply talking about is attaching that oxygen to the hemoglobin and then taking it off later. Remember, whenever you have 2 items bind, so in this case oxygen to the hemoglobin, there's always going to be a shape change. And whenever you take something off of another substance, there's going to be a shape change. So with the hemoglobin, when you bind oxygen to it, the hemoglobin is going to change shape. When you remove the oxygen off, the hemoglobin is also going to change shape back to its original shape. So you have this structure that's changing because of the binding and releasing of oxygen. If we say that the hemoglobin is fully saturated at 100%, that means it has all 4 oxygens attached to it. If it is only partially saturated, then that means it has less than 4 oxygens attached to it. How fast will the oxygen load and unload, in other words, bind and then be released from the hemoglobin? It's going to be very closely regulated. Why? Because it depends on what the needs of the cells are at that particular time. And this can be influenced by the partial pressure of oxygen. It can be influenced by the temperature, the pH of the blood, things such as that. So how does the partial pressure of oxygen influence how much oxygen will be bound to the hemoglobin? You can plot this out on a graph, such as you can see here. It's not a linear graph, it's more of an S-shaped graph. And so in the lungs, where the partial pressure of oxygen is very high, the hemoglobin is almost fully saturated. But in the tissues, the partial pressure is low, and the hemoglobin is going to be less saturated. Which makes sense from the standpoint that in the tissues, you're trying to unload that oxygen. You don't want the hemoglobin to remain fully saturated because you want the oxygen to leave the hemoglobin and move into the tissues where it's needed. But in the lungs, as you inhale, you want the hemoglobin, as it's passing through the lungs, you want those red blood cells to be picking up the oxygen so they can take it throughout the rest of the body. So that's the same in arterial blood. Most of the hemoglobin, it's about 98% saturated. And then in the veins where the blood is returning back to the heart, the hemoglobin is still about 75% saturated. So if need be, there is still oxygen attached to the hemoglobin of the red blood cells as it returns to the heart. And there are different relationships, some of this we'll talk about in a bit, of how the loading and unloading, and that which relates to the percentage saturation on the hemoglobin, is related to activities. It's related to things such as even elevation, and those will be discussed at the end of this chapter. Temperature, increases in temperature can help change a little bit the structure of the hemoglobin, and this essentially is going to increase in the unloading of oxygen. As the temperature decreases, it's going to decrease the amount of oxygen that's unloaded, and so the oxygen remains in the blood. And if you were to plot this out, the light purple line shows what normal body temperature, what the dissociation curve looks like, and how if you change the temperature, you see the change in the effects of the curve. And also, if you change pH, you change the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and all those graphs are just showing you of how the different factors essentially influence how well the hemoglobin can pick up oxygen and release oxygen. BPH, which is involved with also how well the hemoglobin can bind oxygen, can have an influence. Hypoxia is a term when the tissues are not receiving enough oxygen. If this continues too long, it can lead to what we call cyanosis. It's where there's a bluish coloring to the skin. What can cause hypoxia? Anemic hypoxia is when there's not enough red blood cells, or that red blood cells are abnormal. And either way, you're resulting in not enough hemoglobin to be able to bind oxygen to ensure the proper or adequate supply of oxygen to the tissues. Ischemic hypoxia is where you have blocked or impaired circulation. So it's not a problem with the red blood cells, it's you can't get the blood to where it needs to go. Histotoxic hypoxia is when the cells aren't able to use the oxygen. It's possibly being inhibited by poisons. If there's abnormal ventilation or pulmonary disease, the hypoxemic hypoxia, and then carbon monoxide poisoning. Hemoglobin has a much higher affinity for carbon monoxide than oxygen. What does this mean? That means if you have hemoglobin and then it can bind, and you're given two choices. If it can bind to carbon monoxide or it can bind to oxygen, it's going to go for the carbon monoxide. Why is this a problem? Well, certainly, unfortunately, we've all heard of cases, oftentimes in the fall when people first start up their furnaces. If it is not working adequately, the combustion process is not working properly, and it's releasing carbon monoxide. If people are in that house, apartment, building, whatever it is, and they're inhaling that carbon monoxide, the hemoglobin is going to bind to the carbon monoxide, not the oxygen, and therefore you're not getting enough oxygen to your tissues that need it. Unfortunately, carbon monoxide is odorless, it is colorless, so you cannot see it, you do not smell it. And unfortunately, there are times when individuals have been in a facility where there are high levels of carbon monoxide. They don't realize it until it is too late. Carbon dioxide can be transported in a couple of different forms. Some of it's dissolved in the plasma. Some of it will bind to the hemoglobin, but the majority of it is transported as bicarbonate ions. What's going to happen, as you can see on this reaction, you have carbon dioxide. In the blood, what happens? It will bind to water, forming carbonic acid. Once it is bound to the water to form carbonic acid, this reaction excuse me, can continue and release one of those hydrogen ions, and you end up with bicarbonate. This is the way that most of the CO2 is going to be transported in the blood. In this diagram or picture is just showing on the right where you have the blood plasma, on the left where you have your tissue cells, of the flow in blue of CO2 from the tissues. That CO2 is flowing out of the tissues across the space through the interstitial fluid into the capillaries and then binding to the red blood cell. Oxygen is going reverse. Out, it unbinds from the hemoglobin, which is part of the red blood cell, which is listed as HB, that's hemoglobin. And the oxygen is released. It is going to flow out of the capillaries, across the interstitial fluid, and into the cells where it's needed. In the pulmonary capillaries, that diagram you just saw, it's going to be reversed. So part of what this is also saying with the bicarbonate ions and carbonic acid, it's related to the amount of chlorine ions that are also moving. This helps to stimulate the movement of the bicarbonate ions. Now, the amount of carbon dioxide that's going to be transported is also affected by the partial pressure of oxygen. The lower the partial pressure of oxygen, then the more carbon dioxide can be carried. This is going to help to encourage ultimately for the exchange of CO2 at the tissues and also at the lungs. As I mentioned, most of the carbon dioxide is transported in the form of carbonic acid and bicarbonate. This plays a huge role in part of our buffering systems. The buffer is something that helps to resist a change in pH. And so in the blood, the pH is very, very closely monitored. It needs to be between 7.35 and 7.45. So ideally, it's right around 7.4. If it goes below that, there can be severe problems. If it goes above that, there can be severe problems. So it needs to be very closely monitored. So how does the body act in such a way as to maintain that blood pH with very little changes or very minor changes? It has buffers in them. And one of the buffering systems is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer. If the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood rises, how do you get rid of that excess hydrogen ion, which is going to lower the pH? Well, one thing that it does is it can combine to the carbonic acid and forms that bicarbonate. Now, eventually what happens, this reaction you need to realize is reversible, so it's going in both ways. So if the hydrogen ion is too high, like I said, hydrogen ions are basically, that's one of the definitions that we can use for an acid. So that means the pH is dropping. You don't want that to happen. So the bicarbonate is going to combine with that hydrogen ion, and you have that initial reaction of bicarbonate going to carbonic acid and then back to CO2 and water. If the hydrogen ion concentration starts to drop, then the reaction goes the other way. You want to bring the pH back up. And so you're going to be having the carbonic acid releasing some of the hydrogen ions, forming bicarbonate, and it's going to release the hydrogen ions. Changing the respiration rate can have an effect on the blood pH. So if you have very slow, shallow breathing, that can cause then an increase in the CO2 in the blood, which ultimately then is going to result in a drop in the pH. If you have very rapid, deep breathing, that tends to, you're exhaling a lot of that CO2, so it causes a decrease in the CO2 in the blood, and that causes a rise in the pH. So in a later section, we talk about the acid-base balance, and you're going to see there's a couple ways of really helping to control the pH in the blood and maintaining the proper acid-base balance. Respiratory system plays a role in that. The other huge system that plays a role in that is your urinary system, your kidneys. So it's going to be your lungs and your kidneys that are helping to maintain that proper pH balance. How do you control the rate of respiration? It's going to be controlled by different centers in the brain, other reflexes, and there are receptors throughout the body that are picking up changes. In terms of the neural mechanisms, it's going to be typically in the medulla and the pons that are helping to control the respiratory rate. The normal respiratory rate and rhythm is about 12 to 15 breaths per minute. The neurons can stimulate muscles via the phrenic nerve, which innervates the diaphragm, as well as the intercostal nerves, specifically the external intercostals, to trigger the muscles to contract that are necessary for you to inhale. How do you control it? Exhaling, expiratory neurons, they're going to inhibit those inspiratory ones so that then you're going to relax and then exhale. So there's different groups, the dorsal respiratory group, or the DRG. This is going to be getting information from some chemoreceptors. They're sending it to the VGR centers. You also have nerves that are helping to modify and kind of fine-tune the breathing rhythm, so that when you're speaking, there's changes. When you exercise, there's changes in the rate and the rhythms. And also, like when you're sleeping, there's a change in the patterns. All these different respiratory centers and groups are working together to fine-tune and control the breathing rate. Some exactly how the initial control is done, not all this is known. There's a lot we don't know yet. The greater the stimulation means the more motor units are going to be excited, and so that tends to increase the depth, how deep of a breath you take in. The rate and the depth are going to be altered depending on what the needs are. How do you know what the needs are? That's depending on some of the chemical receptors coming in and what's going on at this particular minute. As I'm always saying, that can change in 5-10 minutes. So there are different things that will affect it. Chemical factors, changes in the partial pressures of the CO2, of the oxygen, changes in the pH are going to all have huge effects on the rate and the depth. There are various chemoreceptors located throughout the brainstem, as well as in the aortic arch and the carotid arteries that are constantly monitoring this. One of the largest or most important changes that's very closely regulated is the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide. Like I say, it can detect when carbonic acid dissociates and is being converted to bicarbonate ion, releasing those hydrogen ions, causing the drop in the pH. And so there's going to be a response to that. If the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide levels decrease, typically what happens is your respiration rate is going to slow down. It's going to become more shallow. And this can lead to apnea, which is when you stop breathing. Some people kind of use this to their advantage. Sometimes swimmers, they will purposely hyperventilate. Why? Because that causes a drop in the partial pressure of the CO2. So if it's very low, that means there's going to be a delay before you inhale. And that allows them to stay below water a little bit longer. The thing is, this can lead to very dangerous outcomes because it can lead to really low levels of the oxygen partial pressure too. So this just shows how various changes can be affected by different things, such as the changing of the carbon dioxide, how that carbon dioxide pressure, when it changes, where is it being picked up from? Is it the central chemoreceptors in the brain, or is it the peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies? What is that going to send a message to? Ultimately to the brain, down through the nerves, to increase contractions so that you increase your inhalation. So hyperventilation is increase in the depth and the rate of breathing. What can lead to this? Well, some people, anxiety attacks will cause this. There can be a lot of different reasons. Now, what can it lead to? Dizziness, fainting. What's the treatment for it? Yes, the classic treatment of breathing into a paper bag. Why? Because when you exhale, you're exhaling mostly CO2. If you breathe into a paper bag, then what are you inhaling? You're inhaling more CO2. The CO2 concentration levels in the paper bag are going to be higher than atmospheric air. That's increasing CO2 levels, which then is going to help calm the breathing down. The oxygen partial pressure influence of that on the breathing rate typically only has a slight effect because usually there's a reservoir on the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin usually does not release all of the oxygen. So you would have to have a severe drop of oxygen before you would see an increase of the respiration rate. And this is showing, once again, how you've got the location of on the aortic arch of chemoreceptors, and then also you have those chemoreceptors on the carotid arteries as well. Once again, if the pH in the arteries decreases, that is going to be typically indicative that you have a higher carbon dioxide retention rate. And how are you going to raise that pH? You're going to increase the respiration rate, increase the respiration depth. So the most powerful, most important stimulus for breathing is going to be increased levels of carbon dioxide. The hypothalamus does have some control over the rate and depth of respiration. And some of that is through the limbic system, which remember deals with your emotions. So oftentimes if you're in pain, if you're very angry, you tend to hold your breath. Changes in temperature, which the hypothalamus does control body temperature, that also can have an indirect effect on respiration rate. There are certain irritant reflexes, so when receptors in your bronchioles detect certain irritants such as dust, that's going to have some kind of trickle-down effects. The receptors are irritated by the irritant, stimulates the receptors. What does that do? Then the receptors in the bronchioles then are going to cause a reaction that triggers the bronchioles to constrict or decrease the diameter. The idea is it's trying to protect the lungs to keep those irritants out. There are certain receptors also in the trachea and the bronchi that if those same irritants trigger can cause you to cough once again to try to get those substances, prevent them from getting into the lungs. Some of these irritants can also trigger receptors in the nasal cavity, which would trigger you to sneeze. Once again, the end result is all the same. It's trying to protect the lungs and keep them out. There are some receptors also in the pleural cavity that basically it's monitoring how much the lungs are stretching. And so when you inhale, the lungs are stretching and inflating more as that air is coming in. There has to be a signal to say, okay, stop. And that's what some of the stretch receptors are doing, is when they reach a certain point, then they send a message back to the respiratory centers in the medulla to say, okay, stop the inhalation. They inhibit that, and then that allows you to exhale. So you can see here all the different neural and chemical influences and how they affect the respiratory rate. Exercise certainly has an effect. You tend to increase the respiration rate when you exercise. Why? Because the metabolic needs have increased as well. And this is referred to as hyponemia. The ventilation rate or respiratory rate, it tends to increase sometimes 10 to even 20-fold. The rate increases, the body has to adjust for that incoming oxygen, get rid of excess carbon dioxide, and ideally keep the pH from changing much in the blood. You don't want up and down variances of the pH of the blood. You want it to remain relatively constant. There are different factors involved in the increase in the respiration rate. Number one, psychologically, you know you're going to be exercising. You have stimulation of the skeletal muscles, and then some of the respiratory centers also are going to be responding to movement, not only of the skeletal muscles, but the joints, etc. They're picking up all these stimuli. All of it is saying, okay, increase respiration rate. After you've exercised and your breathing rate starts to decline, there's a gradual decline in the respiration rate as you're trying to get rid of the CO2 levels, get that back down to normal, the partial pressure down to normal levels. Excuse me. During exercise, there's a time period there when and the muscles can lead to anaerobic respiration, because the process of the muscles needing glucose to break that down to form ATP ultimately, and they use the ATP for energy for the muscle contraction to occur so that you can actually exercise, requires oxygen. And there are times when there's not enough oxygen in the muscles, and so it switches to anaerobic respiration. In that process of anaerobic respiration, you form lactic acid. That's going to have an effect also on lowering the blood pH. Why is there a lack of oxygen in the muscles? It's usually the heart has to increase its heart rate to get the oxygen to the muscles, and the muscles have used up their initial storage supply of oxygen, and they have to be able to uptake more oxygen quickly, and that just takes some time to do so. High altitude does have an effect in terms of what we call acute mountain sickness. When you travel very quickly to a high altitude, your book will say 8,000 feet. Some people it's even lower than that. The atmospheric pressure is lower as you increase in elevation. The atmospheric pressure decreases. And because of that, the partial pressure of oxygen also decreases. In other words, there's less oxygen as you go up in higher elevation. So your body has to adjust for that. If you say you drive from here to the Rocky Mountains and you want to go up to, say, Rocky Mountain National Park, if you drive, you are gradually increasing in altitude, so you're adjusting to it. But if you fly and you very quickly travel to the higher altitude, you could suffer from this mountain sickness. What are some of the symptoms? Headache, shortness of breath, nausea, and dizziness. In severe cases, you can end up with much greater problems. So how do you counteract this? Well, you have to acclimate to it. And when we're saying somebody is acclimating to the higher altitude, what are we talking about? Well, your respiratory system is making adjustments. You're also increasing the amount of red blood cells that you are making. If you increase the amount of red blood cells, that means there's more hemoglobin to bind more oxygen, and that's one way that you will adjust for it. The chemoreceptors are going to become more sensitized or more responsive to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is going to increase when oxygen decreases. So it's going to stimulate it. So the kidneys, like I say, are producing more the EPOs, which stimulate the red blood cells to increase the numbers. Usually just 2 or 3 days is enough for you to become acclimated to where you should not be feeling some of those mild symptoms like the dizziness, etc. We used to see this when I lived in Albuquerque, which is at 5,300 feet. Sometimes when people came to visit, if they flew in, we would not go hiking the first couple of days. We'd say, we'll just take it easy, do less strenuous things, leave the hiking that busy outdoor activities, etc., for later in the trips because there were times when we had visitors who did suffer from this.